Hello and welcome to today's webinar. So today's session is looking at calcium requirements and celiac disease. Before we start, a couple of an introduction. My name is Leah Seamark and I'm a specialist gastroenterology dietitian working for Somerset Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. Now, before you watch this webinar, just a reminder, we have previously recorded a couple of other webinars for people with celiac disease. So we've got one for those of you who have been newly diagnosed with the condition, as well as one for people who have been diagnosed with celiac disease for over a year. And you can access those webinars on our website, which is www.patientwebinars.co.uk. Now, the aim of this webinar is to look at calcium requirements for people with celiac disease and talk about how you can ensure you meet your calcium requirements, and also answer the question, do I need supplements? So to go along with this webinar is a handout which you can get from our Patient Webinars website. The handout has been produced by Coeliac UK, which is a really good charity for celiac disease. And the handout provides some useful information about calcium, which we're going to cover in today's session. So to start off with the webinar, a question for you. What are the daily calcium requirements for an adult with celiac disease? Is it A, 500 milligrams, B, 700 milligrams, C, at least 1,000 milligrams, or D, at least 2,000 milligrams? Now, if I told you that the calcium requirements for an adult in the general population is 700 milligrams, would that change your answer? So the answer is at least 1,000 milligrams. So adults with celiac disease should be aiming for at least 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. Before we look at the reason for those increased requirements, we're just going to touch on what our body needs calcium for. So our body uses calcium in many different ways. It's used to help regulate muscle contractions, including our heart. It's used to help with the signaling process within the brain and the nervous system. And it's actually used to ensure we have strong bones and teeth, with 99% of our calcium stored in our bones and teeth. Now, why do people with celiac disease have increased requirements? Well, prior to starting the gluten-free diet, people with celiac disease would have had some damage to the lining of the small bowel. And because of that, they may have had poor absorptions of some vitamins and minerals, including calcium, because it's within the small bowel that absorption takes place. So in the years prior to diagnosis and starting the gluten-free diet, it's possible that people with celiac disease may have not been absorbing calcium efficiently. And because on average it can take up to 13 years for people with celiac disease to get a diagnosis from the onset of their symptoms, it may be that they've had quite a few years where their body's not been absorbing that calcium efficiently. So if our body's not had enough calcium in our body from our diet and it's not been absorbed properly, in order to compensate for that, it may take some calcium out of our body stores, which is within the bones, to enable those essential functions such as the muscle contractions and the nerve signaling to continue. And because of this can lead to a low bone mineral density, which is a measure of how strong your bones are. And it's actually been shown that at diagnosis, 75% of people with celiac disease have a low bone mineral density. And if it's really low, it may be that you may have been diagnosed with osteoporosis, which is a condition which is a weakening of the bones. Now, and that can be shown in this picture here, where the bone of someone with osteoporosis has lots of holes in, and that can mean that they're more prone to bone breakages or fractures if they fall over. So how can I meet my calcium requirements? So the first thing you want to think about is how much calcium are you currently having in your diet? And one way to look at that is to keep a food diary for a few days and try and calculate on a typical day how much calcium you're having. Something you can use to help make that calculation is the handout I previously mentioned. So the Coeliac UK calcium information sheet provides a table of some foods and tells you how much calcium is in a serving. Now you can then use your food diary and that table to try and calculate how much calcium you're having a day. If there's some foods which you're having which aren't on that list, you could also refer to the calcium rich food chooser, which you can find on the Royal Osteoporosis Society's website. Now, once you've kind of figured out on an average day how much calcium you're having, you want to then compare it to that 1,000 milligram a day requirement. Now, if you're getting it most days, that's great. If you're not, you may want to consider trying to include some more dairy source of calcium into your diet. So that includes things like milk. So a glass of milk contains 240 milligrams. A matchbox-sized chunk of cheese is about 220, and a yogurt pot is about 170 milligrams of calcium. You may be having some of the milk alternatives, so things like soya milk or nut milk or rice milk, and that's fine. They do contain calcium as long as you go for the fortified versions. So the fortified versions would have about 120 milligrams of calcium per 100 mils, which is the same amount of calcium that you'll find in normal cow's milk. However, if you opt for the organic version, they don't have anything added to them, so they often don't contain any calcium at all. The only exception for that is the organic almond milk, which will have about 10 milligrams of calcium per 100 ml, but still that's obviously a lot less than the fortified versions. So if you're using the milk alternatives and you want to make sure they contribute to your calcium intake, make sure you go for the fortified versions. You can obviously get calcium from other sources which are not dairy. So for example, a handful of almonds would give you about 70 milligrams of calcium. A couple of slices of your gluten-free bread, the same amount, sort of 70. A couple of teaspoons of sesame seeds, about 170. You get lots of calcium in your tinned fish. So things like tinned sardines and tinned salmon, if they can include the bones, they're a really good source of calcium too. So if you're looking at what kind of a typical day may look like in order to get your 1,000 milligrams of calcium in a day, this is just an example. So for this person here had some milk in their cereal. They had a gluten-free sandwich with a chunk of cheese in. They had a yogurt following their lunch. After the evening meal, they then had half a bowl of rice pudding and a glass of milk, and that gave them their 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. Now, a few top tips to help increase your calcium requirements. It's really good to start the day with either a glass of milk or milk on your gluten-free cereal. You may want to include a yogurt or a milky pudding after your meals. Also, try having an extra milky drink a day. So, for example, it could be a glass of milk before bed, or if you're someone who has coffee, you may want to consider having a milky coffee instead. Include snacks of dried fruits such as figs, apricots, as well as some of your sesame seeds and nuts. You could add green vegetables to your meals, so things like broccoli, kale, cabbage contain small amounts of calcium. And also, if you have some tinned fish, make sure you don't discard the bones, mash them up and eat them, because that's a really good source of calcium. Now, I've just popped in there as a reminder to continue with a strict lifelong gluten-free diet. Obviously, there's lots of reasons why you need to do that if you have celiac disease, but from a calcium point of view, if you have a strict lifelong gluten-free diet, it means that your gut is hopefully healing and therefore it's going to be absorbing that calcium from the foods that you're eating. Now, what if you try to meet your calcium requirements via diet and don't succeed? Well, you may want to consider a over-the-counter calcium supplement as a top-up to your diet. So obviously we would prefer you to try and meet your calcium requirements via your diet, but if you do struggle, you may want to use a supplement as a top-up. Now, you can get various strengths of calcium supplements. So as shown here, they can range from a sort of 1,000 milligrams down to sort of 400 milligrams in sort of a specific calcium supplement. But there's also a small amount of calcium in some of your general multivitamins. Now, as I mentioned, you want to use them as a top-up. So if you've done your calcium calculation, you found out that you're sort of maybe about sort of 600 milligrams a day, you may just want a 400 milligram calcium top-up to get you to your 1,000 milligrams. You don't necessarily need to exceed that. There are also prescribable calcium supplements available, so things like Calcichew D3, Adcal D3 and Cassit D3. They may be something that your GP prescribes if you have any sort of other medical conditions such as osteoporosis. Now, you may have noticed on these tables that we also included the vitamin D content of these supplements. And the reason for that is our body uses vitamin D to help absorb the calcium efficiently. So even if you get enough calcium in your diet, if you don't get enough vitamin D, it's possible that that calcium is not going to be absorbed effectively. So we get vitamin D from the sun and our skin's able to make vitamin D. But the question is, what are the daily recommendations for vitamin D? So would you say it's 5 micrograms a day, 10 micrograms, 15 micrograms, or 20 micrograms? Now, the answer is 10 micrograms of vitamin D a day. Now, most of us can make enough of that vitamin D from the sun over the summer months. However, it's been shown that in the UK, due to our weather, between October and February, we may struggle. So the recommendations are that all the adult population can consider a vitamin D supplement between those winter months, sort of between October and February. However, if you're someone who is housebound or has darker skin tones or actually spend very little time out in the sun at all, you may want to consider a year-round supplementation of vitamin D. Now, we often get asked the question, what is too much calcium? So more than 1,500 milligrams of calcium may cause some gut symptoms such as diarrhea or stomach pains, and taking more than 2,500 milligrams of calcium a day on a regular basis could actually lead to some medical problems which can affect the heart and the kidneys. So really it's just to highlight we should be aiming for around 1,000 to 1,500 milligrams of calcium a day. Ideally you want to be getting that from diet, but you may consider a supplement as a top-up if needed. Now, in summary, people with celiac disease have an increased calcium requirement of at least 1,000 milligrams of calcium a day. Ideally, this should be achieved by a calcium-rich, strict gluten-free diet, and you may need to consider a calcium supplement as a top-up if needed. Now, just a reminder, we have our website www.patientwebinars.co.uk where you'll be able to download the handout I mentioned. You can also visit that website to find out regular updates on new webinars we've produced. You can follow us on Twitter with our Twitter name being @patientwebinars, and there's also our email address contact.webinars@nhs.net if you have any questions. Now, thank you for listening, and we hope you join us for some future webinars.